Good day. Today is Tuesday, 8th April 2025, and we are several days further, a whole week further, into the great trade tariff crisis, which began with President Trump's Liberation Day. His announcement of tariffs against, well, pretty much most countries around the world. And over that period of time, we've seen crashing financial markets, crashing energy prices, and this morning, surprise, surprise, we've had an upward bounce. Now, this appears to be based on nothing other than a message on Truth Social by President Trump that he's had a telephone call with the acting president of South Korea. Now, I say the acting president of South Korea because South Korea's long-running political crisis, which began when the previous president, President Yoon, declared a state of emergency and martial law and tried to dissolve parliament and close down the media and arrest his political opponents. Finally, after many twists and turns, after standoffs between the president and his supporters, between supporters of the president and sections of the military on the one hand, and the parliamentary leadership and their supporters on the other, well, that political crisis, at least for the moment, appears to have been resolved with a unanimous decision a few days ago of South Korea's Supreme Court to uphold President Yoon's impeachment. The result is that President Yoon is now out of office, and we have an acting president whose first task apparently was to telephone Donald Trump and try to persuade Donald Trump to agree to a South Korean trade delegation, rushing to the United States to see if something could be agreed with the United States, with Trump, which might cause the tariffs against South Korea to be relaxed. So President Trump, as he always does, then posted a comment on Truth Social talking about the fact that he'd had an excellent call with the acting president of South Korea, that the South Koreans seemed in earnest about talking about all of the things that he was serious about. He added that he's going to, or rather his negotiators will be bringing up all sorts of other things which appear to be entirely unrelated to the tariff issues, which is interesting. But he says, it's always nice to deal with all the problems at once, which is, well, one way of approaching negotiations, I suppose. But anyway, that's what he writes on this Truth Social post. And of course, he also says that he's looking forward and expects to make a great deal, which is always part of what Trump says and what Donald Trump says he will do. And as far as I can see, on the strength of that one post, and of course all the rumors and messages and whispers that have been circulating that up to 70 countries are contacting the United States, that there's a rush to try to find some means of placating the United States, of getting the Americans to shift on their tariffs. Well, on that basis, the markets today have staged a wobbly recovery. Oil prices have risen, stock markets have risen, and there seems to be some expectation or some hope that everything over the next couple of days will change, and that this massive hike in tariffs was basically some great negotiating ploy by Donald Trump, one intended to extract from concessions from all sorts of countries around the world. Well, I am not quite sure why people cling to this, because other countries have also made attempts to try to get the United States to cancel the tariffs that it has now imposed upon them. Vietnam tried. The Vietnamese have made all kinds of urgent requests to the Americans to get the tariffs reduced. They've actually said that they're happy to move to a zero tariffs system with the United States. Their calls, their requests for a tariff relaxation, so far as I can see, have been completely ignored. The United States listened to them and slammed the door back in their faces. And no less a person, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, Donald Trump's friend, leader of Israel, the country which has positioned itself as America's most important, truest, most faithful ally in the Middle East, the country that Donald Trump himself has repeatedly spoken about in the friendliest and warmest terms. Well, he also has rushed to Washington. He's tried to get the 17% tariffs on Israeli exports to the United States negotiated downwards. These will, according apparently to Israeli economic officials and business people, deal a severe blow to Israel's economy, which is, of course, already in difficulties given the long war that Israel has been in since 7th October 2023 and the Hamas attack on Israel. Anyway, in spite of all of that, in spite of all the friendship, all the warm words that Netanyahu and Trump have exchanged with each other over many years, again, it seems as if, at least for the moment, Netanyahu has fallen short. He met with Trump, he spoke with Trump, he pleaded with Trump, but Trump, as he always does, spoke in a very friendly way, very favorable to Netanyahu, said all sorts of complimentary and kind things to him, but he didn't in the end do what Netanyahu wanted. He didn't reduce the tariffs. I have to say, this visit by Netanyahu to Washington and Trump's response to Netanyahu did remind me a little of the visits a few weeks ago of Macron and Starmer to Washington, when they were also trying to get Donald Trump to do something that basically he wasn't at all minded to do, which is to give a promise of a military backstop, a military guarantee, an undertaking that the United States would be there to support the British and the French when British and French troops were deployed onto the territory of Ukraine. And Trump responded in exactly the same way as he did as he's just done with Netanyahu. He talked very favorably in his usual, sometimes somewhat rambling way, pretending not to hear exactly what his interlocutor, be it Macron, Starmer, or Netanyahu, is saying. He showers his interlocutor with compliments. He gives the impression that they're best friends. But at the end of it all, the interlocutor goes away with nothing. He goes away empty-handed without the thing that he came to Washington asking for. Anyway, that's where we are at the moment. Now, of course, it may be that I am wrong, and it may be that the South Koreans will come to Washington and they will successfully negotiate, and Donald Trump will indeed, at that point, decide to reduce the tariffs on South Korea. But given the whole trend of US policy, firstly, I think that is unlikely. That is my own sense. But secondly, if that does indeed happen, then I suspect that the reality will be that South Korea will nonetheless maintain its trade surplus with the United States. In fact, I would expect that trade surplus to grow substantially, given that Chinese competition, for example, is being reduced. And I would guess that Trump, in time, would not like that very much. He'd start complaining that the South Koreans were once again cheating the United States, and we'd get back to the tariffs again. I noticed that Trump, for example, in that Truth Social post, spoke about South Korea's unsustainable trade surplus, something which he clearly feels very aggrieved about. Anyway, for the record, I think that he will do what he consistently does. He will suggest that a deal is ready there for the making. It's just around the corner, that he's prepared to give ground and all of that. But that in the end, whoever comes and asks for that deal is going to be disappointed. Well, South Korea is a big industrialized country. It's a major exporter. But of course it is dwarfed by China. And here the story is very different, because the Chinese, in response to the tariffs that President Trump has imposed on them, which cumulatively come to 54% of the value of goods that China exports to the United States, well, the Chinese slapped a retaliatory tariff of 34% on American goods which are being exported to China. And Donald Trump has reacted very negatively to this. He has said that if the Chinese don't cancel that 34% tariff on American goods, which they imposed by, I think it was the 8th of April, well, he will impose a retaliatory tariff on China of a further 50%. I'm not sure whether it was the 8th of April, maybe it may have been the 28th of April, actually. But anyway, he's threatening to impose a massive further 50% tariff on China over and above the tariff that he has already imposed. Now, that would bring tariffs on Chinese goods exported to the United States at over 100%. Massive tariffs which, if they are indeed implemented, are going to put China's trade, the trade between China and the United States, in a critical position. Now, China and the United States are the two countries that trade most with each other in the world. They are the two biggest economic players. China exports huge quantities of goods to the United States. The United States, in turn, exports not insubstantial quantities of goods to China. And, by the way, part of the trade in goods from China to the United States is still goods manufactured in China by American companies that have located their production in China and which manufacture their goods in China so that they can be exported back to the United States. Apple being one example amongst many. So, what happens to the Chinese-American relationship is very important. It is crucial. Now, earlier today, Alex Christoforou and I were privileged to do a live stream on the Duran with Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. He, of course, is somebody who's been making extremely cogent and important criticisms of this entire tariff policy that the Trump administration has been following. He has explained clearly and precisely why the tariffs are not going to resolve America's economic problems, that they're not going to correct the deficits, the twin deficits, the current account deficit that the United States has been running for decades. It is an essential program to watch for anyone who wants to understand the economic consequences of this policy. I say that, notwithstanding my own understanding as to how these tariffs came about and why Donald Trump decided to go this route. As I have also said, I don't believe that the economic system which existed before Donald Trump came in and began all of these moves was a sustainable one anyway. But anyway, that's another question. I don't want to go into the economics of this. The one point that Professor Sachs did make is that he did wonder whether ultimately this whole business of imposing tariffs across the world, right across the world, isn't ultimately some kind of complicated device to try to turn as many countries as possible against China, to get these countries to cut deals with the United States, even as the United States conducts its economic war against China. Well, if that is the plan, and I don't believe it is, by the way, and the reason I don't believe it is because Donald Trump has been talking about tariffs, as far as I can see, pretty much all of his life, going back at least to the 1980s. He's been a consistent supporter of tariffs and of protection. He's one of these people who undoubtedly, well, I am sure, is sincere in his belief that tariffs are the way forward to resolve America's deep economic problems. So I don't think this is just a cunning plan to isolate China and at the same time to put a squeeze on its economy. But if it is, then I'm going to say two things. First, on its own terms, it will fail. China is too important a country for too much of the world for that part of the world which trades with China in that kind of way to choose to turn their backs on it. They're more likely, in the end, to side with China in such an economic war than they are with the United States. The African countries being a case in point, many of the Asian countries ultimately also. By the way, just for the record, Russia too, and I suspect in time, India also. That's the first thing to say. The second is that if we are really looking at a world in which the United States, whilst applying 100% tariffs against China, intended to drive Chinese goods, clearly the objective would be to drive Chinese goods entirely out of the United States, to rid the United States of all Chinese imports at all. Well, if that is the plan, to isolate China and to deal with the trade with China in that sort of way, then that is a direct economic war by the United States against China. One as grandiose and as ambitious as the economic war that the Biden administration launched against Russia directly after the start of the special military operation. Just say. So, just as that economic war ultimately failed and in the end had a more negative impact on the United States, or certainly on America's allies, maybe not so much on the United States, than it did on the intended adversary, which was Russia. So I expect this economic war to have that same effect. Now, the Chinese have been responding to all of this, unsurprisingly. Today, or I think it was yesterday, the Chinese Foreign Ministry official said that China will not back down, that China will continue as it has been doing, that it will fight an economic war, if that is what is forced upon China, to the end, with every expectation that in the end it will emerge victorious That is what the Chinese foreign ministry has been saying. But there's been a much more thorough, much more interesting response to this whole tariff policy, a more detailed response, one which undoubtedly reflects the sentiments of the Chinese leadership. But I'm also going to say, which I have no doubt at all, finds a strong echo amongst Chinese society in general. Anyway, there's been a powerful editorial in connection with all of this from Global Times, which is, of course, a newspaper owned by the People's Daily, which is the official newspaper of the Communist Party of China, and which therefore means that Global Times itself is in effect a voice of the Chinese government. And, well, I'm not going to read the entire editorial, which is fairly long, but it says that China will continue to take resolute and strong measures as the United States threatens a further 50% tariff on China. And the editorial contains comments like this: the United States' abuse of tariffs severely violates the legitimate rights and interests of all countries, breaches World Trade Organization rules, undermines the rules-based multilateral trading system, and disrupts global economic stability. This is a typical act of unilateralism, protectionism, and economic bullying, which has drawn widespread international opposition. China strongly condemns this and opposes this. We will continue to take strong, resolute measures to safeguard our legitimate interests. So that is, of course, all a quote from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. But then China itself, as I said in this editorial, goes on to say, tariff blackmail cannot intimidate China. The US government, under the guise of reciprocity, has announced tariff hikes on all trade partners, including China. The Chinese government's position in opposing the US abuse of tariffs emphasizes that the United States has used tariffs as a tool for extreme pressure and to pursue selfish interests. Tariff blackmail will not intimidate China, nor will it undermine justice. China does not provoke trouble, nor is it intimidated by trouble. Pressuring and threatening are not the right way in dealing with China. And then the article goes on to say that the claims about unfair foreign trade practices are untrue, that the attack on China is an attack on China's legitimate rights in global trade, as well as its long-standing efforts to open up. The so-called reciprocal tariffs have caused enormous damage to the world trading system and global supply chains, and they will pose a serious drag on global economic growth. And then, what I think is perhaps the most important sections in this editorial: China is an ancient civilization known for its traditions of etiquette and respect. The Chinese people value sincerity and trust as the foundation of their relationships. Standing firm in the face of pressure and threats is equally a defining trait of the Chinese spirit. Looking back at history, China stood tall even in times of poverty and weakness. Much less will it ever yield to hegemony today. Compared to the US government's initiation of a trade war with China in 2017, Today, we have a much stronger capacity to withstand pressure, richer experience in handling struggles, and comprehensive preparations to face challenges. China's industrial system and technological autonomy have significantly improved. Its domestic market and economic structure continue to optimize, and its multilateral cooperation and trade partnerships have become more diverse. These factors give China greater confidence in the face of risks. More importantly, China stands on the side of morality and historical right. The United States' latest round of tariff hikes targets more than 180 countries and regions around the world, including even the United Nations designated least developed countries. Some commentators have noticed that such high tariffs will deal a devastating blow to vulnerable nations. China's countermeasures are not a call to confrontation, but a declaration to defend fairness. And then the article goes on. The editorial goes on. The trade volume between China and the United States is enormous. The high tariffs imposed by the United States will inevitably impact the Chinese economy in the short term. China has ultimately made a difficult but correct decision. This confidence stems not only from China's economic strength, but also from the fact that countries globally are participating in economic globalization and benefiting from it, as well as from the depth and breadth of economic and trade cooperation between China and the United States. No one can stop China's development, and China-US economic and trade cooperation aligns with the will of the people. The trend towards economic globalization. Here I should make it clear, by the way, that the Chinese always use the expression globalization in a different way from the way in which it is used in the West. What the Chinese basically mean by globalization is free trade in goods. They have never subscribed to the other aspects of globalization, technocratic governance and governance from single centers and all of those kind of things. And anyway, that's a whole further subject for discussion. Time will ultimately prove that the tide of history is unstoppable, moving forward relentlessly, and that the Chinese people possess sufficient wisdom and strength to meet challenges both today and in the future. China will continue to stand firm on the right side of history and on the side of human civilization's progress, working together with the international community to contribute greater strength to humanity's peaceful development. We urge Washington to immediately stop unilateral tariff measures and to resolve trade differences in an equal, respectful, and reciprocal manner. Well, maybe you take a cynical view of all of these statements that the Chinese are making. Again, I differ. Just as I believe that Donald Trump is sincere in believing that his tariffs are the way to regenerate the industrial heartlands of the United States, that he is absolutely serious about what he's doing, and that he's acting from conviction. I believe that the Chinese believe the same about themselves. I think that they do draw strength from their long history, the longest history of any state existing today. They draw strength also from the enormous growth of their society and economy over the last 50 plus years. And they also believe, just as they say, that they are in the right on this issue. So we are looking at an economic war between titans. And I think anybody in the United States who thinks that the Chinese are just going to roll over and capitulate and do a deal on Donald Trump's terms are probably going to be disappointed. That is my own view about this, and it is this collapse in trade between China and the United States which will shape the economy of the future and which will certainly lead us into a more bloc-driven economic world than the one we have known up to now. Now, there's a few further points to make here as well. If Professor Sachs is right, or I'm not sure that this is exactly his belief, but if his suggestion, because he expressed it as a possibility, he made it clear that he didn't know that this was indeed the objective. But if the objective is, as Professor Sachs floated the possibility that it might be, that this is all some kind of plan to isolate China, the better to wage economic war upon it, then of course this isn't about tariffs, it isn't about rebuilding the US economy, it isn't about restoring jobs to the United States' industrial heartlands at all. It is about waging economic war against an adversary, a rival. And put it that way, you can see that the argument from China's side that right in that case is on its side would have even greater force. In fact, it would at that point unquestionably be true. It would be a deeply cynical motivation on the part of the United States, and the Chinese would be right in arguing that right was on their side. For the record, and just to repeat again, I don't think it is that way. I don't think that is Trump's own thinking, his own reasoning in taking these steps. That's the first thing I'm going to say. The second is that an awful lot of people have been writing recently about the Nixon shock of the early 1970s, about how the United States responded to the gathering economic pressures upon itself in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the fact that the United States was slipping into a current account deficit, that it was finding that countries were losing confidence in the dollar and were insisting on payments in gold, and that the United States was seeing its formerly massive gold reserve deplete. By the way, and just for the record, for those who are interested in cultural history, in the Bretton Woods system, which existed in the 1960s, the leading currencies were fixed to the dollar, which in return was fixed at a certain price to gold, with the agreement by the United States that countries could demand payment for their exports to the United States in gold rather than dollars. I'm grossly simplifying here. The system was more sophisticated than that. But anyway, countries that ran a trade surplus with the United States could insist on holding gold, getting the United States to transfer gold to them in place of dollars. And this was, in some ways, a gold-based system, in the sense that the dollar was basically linked to gold. And if you go to that famous film of 1964, I think it was, Goldfinger, where there was an attempt in the book and the novel, there was an attempt to destabilize the price of gold by exploding a nuclear device inside Fort Knox. The purpose of that would have been to bring the entire financial system of the West, the entire Bretton Woods financial system crashing down. That was made even more clear in the novel that preceded the novel than the film itself. But anyway, going back to the 60s, the people have been comparing what Donald Trump has just done to what Richard Nixon did in the early 1970s. He, too, came to understand that the United States was running a chronic, systemic current account deficit. He broke the link between the dollar and gold. His team of negotiators then managed to ensure that the Saudi government would insist that the dollar in future be linked to oil, with the Saudis insisting that all payment for oil should be made in dollars, this eventually being accepted by the entire OPEC cartel and by all of the other major oil producers. That in turn obliged all international traders, everybody who worked in the international system, anybody who bought oil, which of course is essential for the functioning of a modern industrial economy. Oil remains to this day the most widely traded commodity. It obliged them to hold dollars. The result was the creation of the reserve currency status of the dollar, which meant that the United States could just go ahead and continue to run its current account surplus, and that would nonetheless mean that despite running a current account surplus, it would not impact immediately on the United States. There would not be a crash of the dollar. There would not be problems in the US economy in the way that there might otherwise have been. So that was the Nixon shock of the early 1970s. And some people are comparing this event that Donald Trump has carried out with the Nixon shock of the 1970s. They're saying that just as Nixon was looking to deal with the problem of the current account deficits that the United States was running in the 1970s by floating the dollar and breaking the link to gold, so Trump is looking to address the problem of the US's current account deficits, the surge in imports into the United States, leading to the hollowing out of US industries, the collapse in the heartland that he associates with that. He's trying to do that through this policy of tariffs, targeting China most specifically. And so people are making this parallel. Well, what I would say about this is that, of course, the world of the early 70s is profoundly different from the world we are looking at today. I'm not going to discuss the economics of this in detail because that's a big topic. But one of the things that people, it seems to me, who are making these parallels are overlooking is that in both cases, the Nixon shock and the Trump shock are the product of one thing. This is one point where there is a commonality, it seems to me. They are the product of one thing: a defeat for the United States in war. The war in the 1960s was, of course, the war in Vietnam. The United States made a massive commitment to the Vietnam War. It deployed 500,000 troops to fight the communists in Vietnam. American factories and American industries were redeployed away from civilian production to provide weapons for the US Army that was fighting the communists in Vietnam. The United States obviously had to fund that war, and it had to provide funding to support the Vietnamese government. It was also, at the same time, embarking on its immensely ambitious Great Society program in the United States, and it was also conducting its enormously ambitious and enormously expensive space program, the one that led to men reaching the moon. And it was also, perhaps most expensive of all, engaged in a massive nuclear arms race at that time with the Soviet Union, which was forging ahead, building intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear submarines and anti-ballistic missiles, interceptors, and decisively changing the overall military balance in its favor. So the United States, confronted with all of that, confronted with the fact that the war in Vietnam, which had in part been intended to help the United States reverse this trend, which was working against it, or so it seems, had to carry out a grinding reversal of course, economic course, and of course it did so by the Nixon shock, by severing the link to gold, because all those factories producing weapons rather for the war, are no longer producing civilian goods for the American market, and all of that overspending by the US government on all of these enormous problems was sucking in imports into the United States, creating the current account deficit, which has never since really gone away. All of that, as I said, led to the decision to break the link with gold. Vietnam, the military defeat the United States suffered there, the long war the United States waged there, all of that was instrumental in bringing about the Nixon shock. And I would suggest that the parallel that exists today is with the war in Ukraine. The United States, again, has been supplying vast quantities of weapons to Ukraine, maybe not quite on the scale as happened in the 60s, but still on a substantial scale. It has also been heavily involved, as we know, in running the war in Ukraine, far more heavily involved than had been previously acknowledged. And maybe the economic effects of the Ukraine war have not been quite the same, but they have nonetheless been substantial because, in contrast to the 1960s, the Ukraine war was also fought in the world of economics, with the United States and its allies seeking to wage an economic war against Russia. Well, defeat in that war, just like the defeat in Vietnam, is now producing a spasm of decisions on the part of the United States trying to shift its policies. So economically, in economic terms, in economic policy terms, in the early 70s, it was severing the link to gold. In economic terms, today, it is imposing tariffs. In both cases, you could see this as a kind of response to a military defeat. A military defeat not fully acknowledged. Remember, in 1971, when Nixon severed the link to gold, the dollar's link to gold, the war in Vietnam still had 4 years to run. South Vietnam had not yet been overrun by the communists. It still seemed as if there was a struggle to play with. And again, but anybody who was familiar with the realities could already see the clear trajectory of travel. It was pointing clearly towards a communist victory and a defeat by the United States. And the same is true today in Ukraine. The war is still being fought. It continues. There's no public admission yet in the United States that it is lost. Again, as in the early 1970s, there was talk about finding a negotiated solution, peace with honor and all that. Something similar is going on today. But anybody who looks at the realities of the war can clearly see that the trajectory of travel, which is that it's pointing clearly towards a Russian victory. And again, some of the diplomacy today has a kind of weird echo of the diplomacy of the 1970s. So just as in the early 1970s, the United States, which appeared to be losing the arms race against the Soviet Union, or believed it was, which isn't quite the same thing. Anyway, the United States at that time needed, or so it felt, to increase pressure on the Soviet Union, to isolate the Soviet Union. And so we had Kissinger going to China, and the rapprochement between China and the United States, and the Chinese-American axis against Moscow of the 70s and 80s, the playing, as it was said at the time, very condescendingly, of the China card against the Russians. And one reads quite a lot, and apparently there's been quite a lot of chatter about this amongst people close to the administration, that today the Trump administration is trying to do the same thing. Again, it's responding to the fact of a military defeat in something like the same way that the Nixon administration tried to do. It's identified China as the great adversary in the 1960s and 70s. The great adversary was the Soviet Union. That was the superpower. That was the US's main peer competitor. Today it is China, so we do a reverse Nixon. We patch things up with the Russians, pull away our army from Europe, redeploy it against China, and try to win the Russians over into some sort of alliance against China. Well, this time that definitely is not going to work. I've discussed this many, many times. This whole idea that the United States can play Russia off against China in the way that the United States played China off against Russia in the 1960s is based on a false premise, which is that the Russians somehow fear and resent the Chinese and are aching to escape from the strategic partnership they have formed with China. Nothing could be further from the truth, in my opinion. At a personal and political level, the relationship between China and Russia is extremely strong. In the 1970s, by contrast, it was, of course, extremely bad. The Russians understand fully that the relationship with China not only secures their interests, but gives them leverage over the United States. And they are not going to sacrifice that relationship and cause themselves enormous problems on their enormous border with China, simply in order to satisfy the Americans, who in Ukraine have fought a covert war against them. So this is a complete misunderstanding. And if that is the diplomacy, then that is driving some of these decisions, then I predict it will fail. Moreover, I'm going to say something else. There is a view in the United States that the opening to China that happened in the 70s and the 1980s, the United States is opening to China at that time in order to wean China away from the Soviet Union and to break this, to break up the communist world. That this resulted in the United States being played by China, that China took advantage of this. I'm not sure why it's assumed that China would not take advantage of this, but anyway, that the Chinese took advantage of this, and that it is this which left the United States ultimately in a worse position. Even though, in long-term geostrategic terms, the Chinese pivot towards the United States in the 70s, did not bear perhaps quite the geopolitical fruit that some people assumed. Soviet-Chinese relations, as it happens, began to improve in the early 1980s, significantly before the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Just saying. But anyway, I can quite perfectly well believe that with all of these trade deals being floated by people like Kirill Dmitriev with the Americans, and I'm not, by the way, suggesting in any way that he is not entirely sincere about what he's saying. I mean, there would be mutual advantages for the Americans and the Russians to trade with each other, and an improvement in relations between America and Russia is a good thing in itself. But I could quite easily see how, if the Russian economy takes off and the United States does open itself up to Russian competition in some sectors, that people will say at some point in 10, 20, 30 years' time that the Russians played the Americans. Anyway, let's move on, because saying that all of these actions are in part an American response to a defeat in war, which I think is, by the way, to a great extent the case, without in any way discounting the underlying economic causes within the United States itself, which are, of course, also interconnected with US foreign policy, because US foreign policy has had a major impact on US economic decision-making as well. Anyway, that brings us back to the topic of the war in Ukraine. And that war is, of course, continuing to be fought. Now, Donald Trump has again expressed annoyance with the Russians about the fact that they continue to conduct major missile and drone strikes across Ukraine, though not, it seems, in this case, specifically targeting Ukraine's energy system. The Russians, for the moment, appear to be abiding by the energy truce. Just saying. Anyway, Trump has expressed some annoyance about this. There is talk about a further round of negotiations between the Americans and the Russians next week, but no actual word that that is indeed going to happen. But I do get the sense that just as Richard Nixon in the 1970s had basically decided that the war in Vietnam somehow or other had to be wrapped up and that the Americans needed to pull out, and that this is a consensus view within the American elite, Trump and his people have come to the same view, and that some of these expressions of annoyance and irritation towards the Russians by Trump basically are misleading. There doesn't seem to be, in the end, much conviction behind them. Now, I say that because earlier today there were reports that the United States is removing its troops from a base in Poland, which has been a major transit point for arms supplies by the United States to Ukraine. Now, the US authorities have gone out of their way to say that these troops are not being withdrawn from Poland. They're simply being redeployed to another part of Poland, and that for the time being, transit of military supplies through this base to Ukraine will continue, but that it will be Polish personnel who are managing the logistics. I am not fully convinced by these explanations. To me, this looks like preparation for the day, which I suspect is only a few weeks into the future, when arms supplies, large-scale arms supplies to Ukraine through these bases actually ends. I would have thought that the United States would not want the logistics of an ongoing operation to be in the hands of a third country. And the fact that they are taking their troops away is a strong sign that that logistical operation eventually, fairly soon, is going to be wound up. Apparently, some weeks ago, the US also closed down a base in Greece, in the town of Alexandroupolis, where which was also being used as part of the logistical route, supplying weapons to Ukraine. I'm guessing here to the Balkan countries that are on the Black Sea. I suspect the Greek route was for the supply of weapons to Odessa, whereas the Polish route, more northerly route, was for the supply of weapons to Lviv and places of that kind. Just to say. So it looks to me as if the United States is gradually, quietly closing down this logistical operation. And that points to me, that suggests to me that quietly a decision has been made to start to draw down, to start to wrap this thing up. The priority is conflict with China. So for that reason, the United States no longer really wants to continue to invest heavily in Ukraine. They understand that this is a lost war, and they're not going to continue to invest in it. They're not going to continue to throw weapons into the black hole that is the war, weapons which they probably feel are better used in the Pacific. So that comes with reports that I saw circulating yesterday, reports which, however, I'm not absolutely sure how reliable they are, that the United States intends to reduce its forces in Europe by some 10,000 men. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, was recently in Europe. He was giving all kinds of assurances that NATO will remain, that the United States' commitment to NATO is unchanging, things like that. But if the United States does indeed start to draw down its forces in Europe, and these are only reports so far, they're not confirmed decisions. If that does indeed happen, then I think that is a further sign that the United States, not just Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth, but other people in the Pentagon, people like Elbridge Colby, but also some of the military officers in the Pentagon as well, are now gradually beginning to take steps to close down this project that was launched by the Biden administration, that has its origins under the Clinton and Bush administrations and Obama administrations, that it's about to close it down because they recognize that victory in Ukraine is being achieved by the Russians. Now, on this, I've noticed that there are now the first admissions by several commentators of a point that Alex Christoforou and I made in a program we recently did on the Duran, and which I have spoken about myself on these programs, that talk of a big Russian offensive as being something in the future is wrong, because in reality a Russian offensive already seems to be actually underway. Now, we've had an awful lot more news over the last 24 hours about further military movements in Ukraine, and they all tell the same story of Russian advances right across the front lines. Now, there's been quite a lot of information from the Kusk Sunumi region. It looks as if the battle for Guyevo, a village in Kursk which the Ukrainians controlled, small place apparently, but they were there holding out, surrounded by the Russians, but apparently that's now ended. Guyevo has fallen completely under Russian control. It's said that the Russians are about to capture the small hamlet or farm station of Olyekshi, which is right on the Ukrainian border. There is one other village, bit to the south, which the Russians have not yet reached. I believe it's called Gornyak. But anyway, fighting is about to start there. The Kursk operation has basically ended. The battle for Kursk is over, is all but over. I say that, by the way, there was an extraordinary, a bizarre article today in the Daily Telegraph, which attempted to refight the battle of the Russian advance into Suja through the gas pipeline. It claimed that this operation through the pipeline was far from being the resounding success that the Russians said, was actually a disaster and a failure, that the Ukrainians quickly either knew that the attack was underway, or maybe they were caught by surprise, but they rapidly responded and the Russians suffered heavy losses and nothing very much was achieved by it. I was not there. I am not familiar with the mechanics of this particular incident. I am completely unable to understand, however, why the Daily Telegraph now feels that trying to represent what was clearly a Ukrainian defeat, a catastrophic Ukrainian defeat, into some sort of victory, why they think that this serves any useful purpose at this particular point in time. Suffice to say that whatever exactly happened with the pipeline operation, the Russians won. That surely is the thing that, in the end, most matters. But anyway, put all that aside. The Ukrainians are about to be driven out of those small slivers of territory in Kursk region that they still control. But the Russians are now very strongly positioned inside Kursk region, Sumy region. They captured Basivka a short time ago, and there are now reports that they have either captured the village of Lochnia or that they are about to do so. And if they do capture the village of Lochnia, then the place that they will attack next is the village of Yunakivka. And beyond Yunakivka, well, suffice to say that the distance between Yunakivka, which lies on the main road to Sumy, the distance between Yunakivka and Sumy is not that great. Apparently the Ukrainians have tried, in a great rush, to build up some kind of fortified lines around Yunakivka. The big question is, will these lines hold? And do the Russians actually plan to capture Sumy, the city of Sumy? I don't know. I doubt that the Ukrainians do, and there will be a lot of worry and anxiety about this. Now, that is one important area of the battlefront. The Russians are advancing there. There is a gathering crisis for the Ukrainians now in the entire area of the Oscol and Jerobets rivers. The Russians, as I discussed in recent programs, have now established this big bridgehead on the west bank of the Oscol River. They are now literally, as far as I can see, on the outskirts. Well, not on the outskirts, on the fringes of Kupiansk. It seems to me that really all that's left in terms of Kupiansk is a Russian decision to attack Kupiansk. If the Russians now decide to launch an offensive against Kupiansk, which they're likely to do at some point in the next couple of weeks, no doubt, I cannot see how Kupiansk can be defended any longer. But put that aside, there's an even more critical situation developing further south in the area of the southern parts of the Oscol and Jerobets rivers. Now, a couple of weeks ago, the Russians captured a village on the Jerobets River called Terny. There was a lot of talk about a year ago, I remember, about how the Ukrainians supposedly won a famous victory against a Russian armored column in the area close to Terny. But regardless of that, Terny is now securely under Russian control. The Russians recently, apparently, captured a village south of Terny, large village south of Terny, called Yampolovka. They're now pushing south from Yampolovka, and it seems even Ukrainian reports are now saying that the Russians are fighting for control of another important village, a heavily fortified village called Torske, and that the Russians may control up to 50% of Torske. And there was even a report last night that Torske had already fallen to the Russians, though I suspect that was premature. Now, if Torske falls, and there doesn't seem to be any way, if that happens, that the Ukrainians could mount a counterattack to recapture it, because the Ukrainian forces look fairly dispersed, then the Russians have a clear route to the next village south, which is a village called Yampol. And they also, if that happens, are strongly positioned to begin an advance westwards to the town of Liman, Krasny Liman. Now, the Russians briefly controlled Krasny Liman in the summer of 2022, but it was recaptured by the Ukrainians at the high point of their Kharkiv offensive in the autumn of 2022. However, if the Russians recapture Liman now, and also Torske and Yampol, which I believe they also controlled in the summer of 2022 for a short period, if the Russians are able to capture these places now, it will be a completely different situation from the one which existed in 2022. Because at that time, the Ukrainians still held Siversk, and they were able to continue to supply Siversk from the south, because at that time the Ukrainians controlled the two cities south of Siversk, Bakhmut and Solidar. Bakhmut was, at that time, a major logistical center tying together the Ukrainian defenses in this area. Well, the Ukrainians lost Bakhmut in May 2023 as a result of the attack of the Wagner organization. And previously, I believe in January 2023, they also lost Solidar. And the Russians control most of the villages now north of these places. So if Yampol falls and Liman falls, the Ukrainian forces in Siversk will be cut off from resupply. They will be, in effect, encircled in a long salient without any realistic hope of relief or of resupply. And I suspect that even Zelensky at that point will recognize the futility of trying to cling on to Siversk for just a few more weeks, and it is likely that the Ukrainians will be forced to retreat from Siversk. The Russians are very close to Siversk already. They control most, if not all, of the village of Verkhamyanska, immediately to the west of Siversk. They have forces west, east, north and south of Siversk. But if the supply lines to Siversk are cut, then I think the Ukrainians will withdraw from Siversk. And that will straighten out the entire line in this area, bringing the Russians much closer to Slavyansk and leaving them in a much stronger position than the one they were in 2022. And if, alongside all of that, the Russians move and capture Kupiansk and recapture Izium, and if all of these other places fall, it's difficult to see how Izium could be defended. Then Slavyansk will be held in a semicircle. And south, the southern end of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation is also now virtually in a semicircle. The Russians, there were reports today from the Ukrainians finally acknowledging that the Russians are now in complete control of Donetsk. Just saying. The Russians appear to be close to encircling the remaining Ukrainian troops in central Chasiv Yar. It's possible that the Ukrainians will retreat from Chasiv Yar over the next couple of days. One way or the other, the Battle of Chasiv Yar also looks like it's close to ending, in which case the southern part of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation will also be in a semicircle. Put this all together, and I think that the Russians are in a very strong position, will be in a very strong position, probably in a few weeks, to start storming every part of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation one by one. They will probably, logically, attack Konstantinovka first. It is in low ground relative to Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. Some are suggesting that it might even be undefendable. If Konstantinovka is then captured, then I don't really see how the Ukrainians will be able to defend Slavyansk and Kramatorsk for very long. All of the various positions around these two cities which made their defense possible will have been stripped away. And with the Russians in a semicircle around both of these cities, they will be able also to block to interfere with communication, with resupply to these two cities. It could be a collapse similar and as rapid to that of the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk conurbation, which took place in the early summer of 2022. That was an analogous, a similar-sized conurbation in Lugansk, which the Russians were able to storm, as I remember, very quickly. Anyway, that's one part of the Russian offensive. Important to remember, if these cities, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, fall under Russian control, then essentially Donbas, the whole of Donbas, will come under Russian control. If we go to the other place, which the Russians are now also fighting for, Pacross is now also in a semicircle. The Ukrainian counterattacks around Pacross have all failed. As far as I can see, all of the villages that the Ukrainians claimed at various times to have recaptured, Shevchenko, Pishanye, Kotlino, Soleno, are under Russian control. The Russians have recently captured the village of Uspenivka. They appear to be increasing the territory they control in Udachny. Again, they've also advanced north of Vozhizhenka, west of Pacross. They've cut the road leading from Pacross to Konstantinovka. Again, it seems to me that when the Russian attack on Pacross comes, it will probably be over much more quickly than most people suspect. It will not be a Bakhmut type situation, because in Bakhmut and Avdiivka and Krasnogorovka and all of these other places, the Ukrainians still had routes to supply their garrison. In Pokrovsk and these cities in the Donbas, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the routes of resupply will not be there. Now, again, I don't want to provide a timeline for all of these things, but I can see how this could all shape out over the next few weeks and months, and do so very rapidly. But even as these big events are taking place in the north, on the northern front lines, and around Pacross, the Russians continue their advances in Zaporozhye and in southern Donetsk region, southwest Donetsk region. They are apparently now within 30 kilometers south of the city of Zaporozhye as they fight for control of the village of Kamenska. And that's obviously still a considerable distance, but 30 kilometers does actually put Zaporozhye within long-range artillery range. Not perhaps so much guns, but certainly multiple rocket launchers, like the Russian Tornado S system, which is the Russian equivalent of the HIMARS. So just saying, an offensive against Zaporozhye city, perhaps in the second half of this year or in the summer, not impossible, I would have thought. Again, the Russians are moving fairly quickly in this area. Now, one of the places that they are apparently now capturing, incidentally, is the big area of the lithium deposit near the village of Shevchenko. Now, this is confusing because the Russians have captured already 2 villages called Shevchenko in this general area. Apparently, the lithium deposit is located close to another village of Shevchenko, which the Russians have now reached. And there is now apparently fighting going on exactly on the territory of this lithium deposit that we have been hearing so much about. So I said that the war in Ukraine has been lost by the United States, by the collective West, just as the Vietnam War. It was clear to careful observers that the Vietnam War had also been lost already by the early 1970s, by the time of the so-called Nixon shock. So there we are, a very complicated world now starting to emerge. We still have to see how all of these tariffs will play out. We'll see also whether, as part of these diplomatic moves that the Trump administration is initiating, they do indeed go ahead with the Black Sea Initiative. There are talks, resumed talks about it in Riyadh, and that there is finally a decision made there, maybe by the Americans and the Russians talking with each other to move towards sanctions relaxation by the United States agreeing to ensure Russian commercial ships carrying grain and other foodstuffs and provide corresponding accounts for Russian banks which need payment in dollars for the sale of agricultural goods, as the Russians have insisted in return for their rejoining the Black Sea Initiative. I'm starting to wonder whether Trump's decision to bring up the Black Sea Initiative again was not really intended in his own mind and in that of his closest advisors to actually lead to a ceasefire or an end of the conflict in Ukraine. I'm wondering whether really it's a pathway towards gradually easing sanctions on Russia. Notice again, to remind everyone again, the Russian readout of the conversation in Riyadh made it clear that it's not just the Russian Agricultural Bank that the Russians seek to see reconnected to SWIFT, or at least to be able to engage in dollar trading again. It is any Russian bank or financial institution that concerns itself with the food trade. Now, you can come up with all kinds of arrangements. You can say that they can accept, they can receive payments in dollars for exports of food, but not perhaps for exports of oil. You can do things like that. But if the United States starts to take these steps to reopen accounts, to allow accounts to be opened in Russian banks and to receive those sort of payments without objecting to it, and those payments being made through blockchain or perhaps through cryptocurrencies, with President Trump apparently very interested in involving the United States in trade in cryptocurrencies. Just saying. Well, I think at that point, the crisis in Europe, the understanding in Europe that this is a completely different world, is going to finally hit home. Because at that point, the United States will be signaling in the clearest possible way, the Trump administration will be signaling in the clearest possible way that from this point on, together with the tariffs, together with the reductions in US forces in Europe, the decision unilaterally, not just to ease sanctions against Russia unilaterally, but to circumvent European sanctions means that the United States has divorced itself once for all and forever from the Europeans, and that it is the end of the collective West. Well, there it is. We aren't there yet, and there's many things still in play. But I've always argued that this conflict in Ukraine was the one that was shaping the international geography. It was causing the fundamental changes in the international system. And we're beginning to see the first strong signs of that. Anyway, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget also that you can go to our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.